Good evening, everybody. I'd like to begin by welcoming everybody present here in this room in a temple. And if you're already feeling slightly overheated, we have asked for the air conditioning to be switched on. So with any luck, things will cool down very soon. I would also like to say good evening to the people who are watching and listening to this event remotely. I'm very much hoping that you can see and hear us, and we're delighted that you're participating as well. And let me say straight away before I forget that anybody who wants to ask a question or make a comment during the course of the evening from a remote location can please type their question or comment into the chat function, and we will see that and we will be able to pass that on in the course of the discussions. The next thing I want to do is to say something very, very important. You can't put on an event like this without some help. And the first person that I want to thank is our administrator, Rachel, who's at the back there. And she has been largely responsible for ensuring that people can join remotely. So thank you, Rachel. I also want to thank my colleague, Bren, with whom I worked in contributing a little bit towards the submissions that we made to the Commission, and who's largely responsible for the arrangements for this meeting. So thank you very much, Bren. I just want to introduce you at any rate by name to the people who are sitting alongside me. To my left is Jim Gallagher, who was an advisor to the Commission. My belief is that he was very largely responsible for the writing of the document. He'll tell us, I'm sure, if that's not the case, but we certainly have him to thank for the enormous effort that went into the production of the Commission's work. Then to my left, we have Sarah Sackman and Simon Henig, who are two members of the Commission. And if, as I think, this is one of the most important reports that has ever emanated from the Labour Party, then we certainly have them to thank for that. And at the far end is Professor Thom Brooks from the University of Durham, who is a member of the Society of Labour Lawyers. I'm not going to introduce anybody else at length. They can introduce themselves a little bit more when they come to speak. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Jim, and he is going to talk to you about the conditions, the circumstances which led to Keir Starmer setting up this commission a couple of years ago, and summarize some of the key elements of the report. Then we'll hear from Sarah and from Simon and from Tom, and then we'll open it up for discussion in the audience itself. This is intended to be completely informal, so if you want to interrupt with a question and think it would be worth getting clarification on straight away, please feel free to do so. I may then interrupt you, but that's the risk you take. Over to you, James.
Thanks very much. So I think I'll stand up because I want to make life easier. There are a few slides because you can't do a presentation without PowerPoint, but happily these are the only ones you're going to see tonight, I think. Just to introduce the Commission, this was started over 2 years ago, by Keir Starmer, who wanted us to address some constitutional but also wider questions. And it's quite important to realise that this is not, as the title would suggest, a commission on the Constitution. It's a commission on the UK's future, and it is very clearly on both constitutional and economic and social issues, because we can have a great fun writing constitutions. It's a game for all the family. But what we wanted to do was address ourselves to things that were causing real world problems. The first real world problem is an economic one. The UK has had a dreadful decade economically. We are heading towards becoming a middle-income country. And it's not just that incomes have gone down in real terms for most folk, but the other indicators of a good light are going in the wrong direction. We've just taken two at random in this slide. How long we can expect to live, and for all the previous decades in recent history, that's been going up. It started to stop going up, and when I come from in Scotland, it's actually managed to go down. And even our educational attainment has stopped growing, and this is just a random English number to demonstrate that. Now, you probably spotted that life in the UK wasn't great over the last 10 years or so. And I wonder if you have reflected on the geographic significance of this. And here is a slide that just demonstrates that very, very briefly. The UK is the most economically unequal large country. Not quite in their own universe, because we're not too good on Mars. But if you look, and this is one simple measure, there's a whole basket of measures you can use. This is the divergence in wealth, GDP, between the rich places and the poor places. And in our country, it's big, and it's been getting bigger, and it's deeply, deeply damaging. Not just to the economic chances of people, but to their life chances. And remarkably, poor people in poor areas have worse life chances than poor people in rich areas. This geographic inequality is deeply, deeply damaging. Remarkably, as it turns out, the UK is now slightly less well off than the former East Germany. And the former East Germany is caught up almost with the former West Germany. So we have a major economic inequality problem. I'm not going to spend much more time on that, but that's part of the driving force of this. But we also have another problem. Sorry, I should have gone on to this slide. People have noticed this economic problem, by the way. If you ask them, what determines your success in life? Look at these these blue things tell you that people realize that where they live really, really matters to how they get on. It matters more than they think in ethnicity. It matters more than their innate talents. It matters more, they think, than their gender. The fact that they live, say, in the northeast compared to the southeast. This is a big, big problem. But it's linked to the other problem, and that is that people have ceased to trust their government. And to be honest, they don't just mean bad Boris, right? This is a structural problem that the UK has had for decades. We are at the bottom of the league for having trust. Well, Belgians aren't doing too well, but they managed that government for decades. Right? Things are not great in Poland. Down here, we are at the bottom of the acceleration of trust league. Costa Rica is a bit worse. I don't quite know why. Chile is in a major constitutional crisis. So this is a major, major problem. And the interesting thing about it is it's not simply that UK institutions are distrusted. Our courts, our legal system, our police, our local government is as trusted, broadly speaking, as the same institutions in other countries. This is our central government and parliament, which are deeply, deeply distrusted. Move on. And part of the driver of that, almost certainly, is that we're also the most centralized system of government in more or less the developed world. These are small countries, obviously. We're ahead of Italy and France in centralization on several measures. More interestingly, we're ahead of other large countries, indeed, remarkably ahead even of the US today. So this is a major problem for us, and it's at the root, the Commission thinks, of the problems that it's seeking to address. And the problems it's seeking to address, if you would carry on, Rachel, can be illustrated by, well, who do you trust? Well, you trust your local councillor. If you've got a metro mayor, you trust your metro mayor. If you've got devolved government, you trust your devolved government. Great news. MPs are just ahead of members of the House of Lords. Okay, this is a big problem. Our central institutions are deeply, deeply distrusted, but our more local institutions are quite well trusted. And our root of the problem is that for most parts of the country, most of England in particular, we don't have that middle level of government, which other countries have, which is economically relevant and tends to get trusted. My friends, both of them in the SNP, think that they are trusted because they are a really good government. No, they're trusted because they're nearer to the people they serve. Nobody else interested. Sorry.
Where's the data from the slides with
this is polling we did for the commission. Yeah, it's a big sample, it's about 2,000, I think. It's all available on the Stack Data website if they're a data obsessive, like I sometimes become. So, got a problem of centralisation. We've got a problem of over-centralisation of government, distrust in government, and economic centralisation. These things go hand in hand. And I'll come back to Scotland later, but let me just reflect on one thing before I hand over to Sarah. What is driving these recommendations is the understanding that people in this country feel two things very strongly. First, that they are, to use Mrs. May's phrase, left behind. Economically left behind. Very large proportions of the country feel that way. And secondly, that they are politically ignored. Central government pays no attention to their needs. And the recommendations in this commission therefore seek to address both of those things in a way which is linked. And Simon will be talking about the decentralisation of power. But the trick in all of this is to find a way to make sure that power stays decentralised, that once it is decentralised, and that is part of the reasoning behind our constitutional recommendations, which include a fun topic of reforming the House of Lords.
Thank you very much, Jim. Let's have a little round of applause. Not only wake up your neighbour if he's nodding off. So I think we'll move now to, you were coming back to you a bit later.
Yes, you will.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, promise in store. So Sarah, we'll ask you to speak now, please. By all means, introduce yourself, tell them a little bit more about yourself, and then you're going to talk mainly about constitutional stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The perfect segue, reform of the House of Lords. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Sackman. I practice public law at Matrix Chambers, but I'm also a parliamentary candidate for the Labour Party in Finchley and Golders Green. And the reason for mentioning that is not just as a plug, Finchley's just at the top of the order line, but because what I want to just reflect on, following on from what Jim just said, is on the political salience of this report. As Jim has introduced the key themes of the report, which a lot of credit goes to Scott Dixon, who's also sat here, who was absolutely key in corralling all the commissioners. But you heard that the central premise of this report was that the deep inequalities that exist in this country, economic inequalities, geographic inequalities, are inextricably linked with over-centralisation and with a lack of trust in politics. And the reason why what I'm about to talk about, socioeconomic rights and reform of the House of Lords, is salient is because it's part and parcel of the package of recommendations that we make in this 150-odd page report. And if you haven't read it, that's what your reading homework is for this evening. The package of recommendations that we make are intended to comprehensively address those problems. Because if we go into the next election thinking that this 20-point lead in the polls is going to hold, then that is a very complacent attitude indeed. The biggest threat to the Labour Party's fortunes in forming the next government at this election is not so much the Tories, but it's what Jim mentioned. It's the politics of despair. It's the lack of trust in political institutions, and in particular our democratic institutions, and in politicians of all stripes. Part of the polling that we did, which informed the Commission's recommendations, showed that well over 50% of those that we polled said it didn't matter who you voted for, we're all the same. And that is deeply, deeply concerning. And it's the politics of despair that I think presents the biggest threat to Labour at the next election. But coming back to the constitutional question, we start this report from the idea that we are in a constitutional moment, and that at the next election, we need a change, not just of government, but in how this country is governed. And as part of that, and it is only a part, this is a comprehensive package of recommendations, and I know that Simon is going to address some of the economic devolution aspects, which are a part of the radical program that we set out. But as part of that is a mission statement, which this report sets out, a mission statement for the UK, which underpins what our Union of Nations are for. Because whether you're making the case in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or in those parts of England that feel themselves to have been left behind, we need a legal statement, as well as a political statement, which says precisely what the United Kingdom is for. And embedded within that, we make the recommendation that there should be a legal requirement that recognises the constitutional footing which local government is placed on, the idea that decisions should be taken closest to those affected by them, that be a constitutional principle enshrined in law, an explicit constitutional requirement that governments push for equalisation to address the sort of geographic inequalities that Jim was referring to, and a recognition not just of the political and civil rights which the last Labour government did so brilliantly to underpin through statutes like the Human Rights Act, but also a recognition that the UK, as part of the UK's mission, we should be guaranteeing minimum socioeconomic guarantees so that irrespective of where in the UK you happen to live, you know that you can access universal healthcare, universal education, and minimum welfare entitlements too. I want to say something about the House of Lords, because inevitably when this report got released and launched into the world at Nexus at Leeds University, it was the House of Lords that got picked up. And only then did the Westminster Press Pack discover, actually, there's a lot more into this report than House of Lords reform. But seeing as I'm talking to a legal audience, I do want to say something about the House of Lords reform recommendations. By the way, while I'm thinking about the launch in Leeds, in some ways, the launch in Leeds was emblematic of what this whole report is about. So I remember getting on a train to Leeds from London at about 5:30 in the morning, arriving in this amazing place. It was launched, the report was launched by Keir and Gordon and Tracy Brabin in this amazing space, which is an incubator, a hub for spin-out small businesses, startups at Leeds University, just the sort of economic cluster of innovation that I hope Simon's going to talk about. And what was amazing is as Keir gets up to the platform, he gets a note passed to him, pointing out that there's been major delays on the train from London to Leeds. And on that train were all the journalists that were supposed to be asking questions. So things had to be delayed by a bit, but it really was symptomatic of, if you like, the geographical space, but also maybe the psychological space between London and the southeast, and the remoteness from power and sort of innovation. This idea that innovation and talent is everywhere, but perhaps opportunity isn't. Anyway, enough about the launch. Back to reform of the second chamber. The report is clear. The report is clear, and it is radical. The current House of Lords, and I appreciate there are members of that esteemed body in the room tonight, and I say this with all due respect to the public service that many members of the House of Lords do in both scrutinising and improving legislation. But this report makes plain that the House of Lords in its current form is indefensible in principle. And actually, that's been a case that's been being made for well over a century. We've been talking about reform of the House of Lords and putting it on a principled and elected footing for well over a century. It's indefensible for a number of reasons. The presence of 92 hereditary peers who are there solely by virtue of birth. The fact that the House of Lords is now so bloated in size, well over 800 members, making it the largest second chamber anywhere in the world besides the People's Republic of China. The fact that it is entirely unrepresentative of the nations and regions of this country, its membership heavily concentrated from members from London and the Southeast. The fact that it has become a body which reflects the patronage and nepotism of the Prime Minister of the day. I think the Sunday Times reported that for £3 million donation to the Tory party, you can pretty much guarantee your peerage. Perhaps the going rate is going up, but it depends whether you carelessly mislaid your cash or not. And of course, the fact that one serves for life and makes the laws of this country for life. And when sole qualification is that patronage, it really is an indefensible picture. And this is not just something that's been dreamt up by a bunch of constitutional lawyers and academics. There is popular support for what we propose, which is the abolition of the House of Lords and its replacement with a new elected second chamber, one which is leaner, more affordable, smaller, with shorter terms, elected and geographically represented of the nations and regions, an assembly of nations and regions, if you like. And fundamentally, we spend a lot of time talking about the purpose of the second chamber, because there's no good just talking about composition, which is where a lot of the debate lies. Oh, yeah, who's going to be in it? How are you going to decide who's going to be in it? We talk about the parameters of how it should be made up, but actually, as important, if not more important, is what is that second chamber for? And we are very clear what it's not for. It's not to override the sovereignty and supremacy of the Commons. It's not responsible for decisions over public spending or forming the government. But what it is responsible for is four things. Firstly, the sort of functions that it performs actually very well now in terms of scrutinising and amending legislation. Secondly, becoming a body that brings together the nations and regions, both in terms of where it's drawn from, but also in its interactions with the other intergovernmental bodies that we recommend in the report to create far more coherence between the centre and the devolved nations and regions. Thirdly, monitoring standards in public life. A lot more could be said about that, but it seems to us that fundamental to restoring the public's trust in our institutions and politicians is integrity in public life and holding those in public life to account. And so creating that as part of the function of the second chamber. And fourthly, perhaps most importantly, the task of safeguarding the Constitution and the distribution of power within it. So where you see, or where a second chamber sees that constitutional statutes, however so defined, and we could have a debate about precisely what should come under that heading, but constitutional statutes such as the Constitutional Reform Act, Human Rights Act, Devolution Acts, Representation of the People's Act, we might add others to that list. Where the second chamber detects that those are being altered, undermined in any way, its function would be to safeguard those and, where necessary, refer the matter ultimately to the Supreme Court as the ultimate arbiter of whether those constitutional conventions and constraints were being undermined by the Commons. And so that, we say, those four functions would be key to what a new second chamber would be about. So I hope that gives you a glimpse into some of the constitutional elements, but there's so much detail in this report, and I really recommend it to you, not just for addressing the insomnia, but also I hope also as providing some of the inspiration and policy meat that we hope will ultimately end up in Labour's manifesto at the next election.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Crystal clear description of those features of the proposals. Now we'll ask Simon to speak to us, introduce yourself a little bit, and then I think you're going to talk more about the kind of socio-economic side of things, which would be very, very interesting. And an interesting feature of the report that it covers such a wide range of issues.
Well, thank you very much, and delighted to be here this evening. My name is Simon Henig. I was leader of Durham County Council for 13 years, from 2008 to 21, and I was first chair of the North East Combined Authority. I'm currently still chair of the Association of Labour Councillors nationally, And I have to say it was a great honour to serve on the commission, which did bring together a very diverse, wide range of people, which I think is really, really important from right across the UK in terms of the different areas that we've been looking at. As you have heard, I've been tasked with saying a little bit about the economy and devolution, which I will do. Clearly, much of what I say is informed by my own experience, which clearly has been in England. But what I would say as a starting point is that I think one of the real benefits of this commission report is that it does look at the whole of the UK together. Personally, I find that a very welcome development. We're not atomising into different parts of the UK. What we're saying is the same core issues are causing problems right across the UK, and of course some of the same solutions are needed. Of course, there are things that are needed specifically in parts of the UK as well, but certainly I believe that it's a real positive that this report addresses the whole of the UK together. So you've already heard from Jim and from Sarah some of what is in the report in terms of the background context. And I think the point that has already been made very importantly is that the fact that this report didn't take as its starting point the sort of constitutional situation within the UK, it actually took as its starting point the economic failure within the UK, the lack of delivery. We've already heard about the stagnation or worse over the last decade. The fact that too much potential is untapped and opportunities, as the report says, are not being equally spread. It is quite shocking, actually, that large parts of Britain are now no better off than parts of the former East Germany, which I remember driving into over potholed roads in 1990 and 1991. And it is really astonishing to see what has happened in terms of the relative position over that sort of 30-year period. Unfortunately, regional economic inequalities have and continue to undermine the lives of millions of people right across the UK. And of course, that goes well beyond the economy. It impacts on people's health, impacts on people's educational opportunities, ultimately in terms of how long people live. And unfortunately, I had figures thrown at me while I was leader of Durham County Council, many of which were heading in the wrong direction. I think Jim actually already alluded to it, that actually towards the end of my period as leader of Durham, people's life expectancy was actually going down, which is really quite extraordinary. So to borrow a phrase from the Labour Party past, we believe Britain does need an irreversible shift in opportunities, income and wealth across the country, and certainly a far bigger than the current so-called levelling up process. To put it more succinctly, we do need radical change. I mean, we've already heard about falling trust in the political system, which clearly is a major issue undermining everything that happens at the moment on a multitude of different levels. I think it's important to say also, we've heard about the some of the opinion polling that was done. What really struck me about that polling was that attitudes are actually very similar across the UK. Actually, there really isn't a huge difference between attitudes in Scotland, for example, and attitudes in many parts of England about some of the issues we face and people's attitudes towards that. In all parts of the UK, people believe decisions should be being taken more locally, closer to where people live, for example. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so appropriate that this report did look at the UK as a whole. Now, as I said, my experience was very much in local government over the last decade or so. Unfortunately, we saw a decade of austerity, cuts of 40% almost over that period of time. My own council in Durham had to cut its budget by upwards of 250 million over a decade. And sadly, those spending cuts as well as austerity was focused more on poorer areas across the country. Actually, my belief is that that played quite a major part in the referendum in 2016, but that's another story in terms of the outcome. The other thing that really is drawn out by this report, but I just want to give a few sort of illustrations of that, is the extraordinary level of control by Whitehall of decisions that really should be being taken elsewhere. We've seen it, as I mentioned before, for example, just recently with the levelling up competition, if you like, the sort of announcements of the places that would be successful and not successful by central government. But we see it in local government in all sorts of other ways as well. There are competitions you may not be aware of in all sorts of areas apart from that, for example, in highways and other areas where councils are bidding against each other for cash. We see financial settlements for 1 year only at the moment, and also not even announced until around Christmas time, when councils, for example, have a legal obligation to set a budget by February or March. So literally giving a matter of weeks to set budgets, which in the case of County Durham are, despite austerity, still in the hundreds of millions. And it really doesn't allow any sort of strategic thinking for the future or stability. England really is the last refuge of the British Empire in the way that it's governed by Whitehall, and it's time for change. Already alluded to some of the key recommendations of reports right at the outset, that decisions should be taken as close as possible to the people affected by them. A constitutional requirement, we're suggesting that political, administrative and financial autonomy of local government is respected by central government, because that has been another issue, as well as a third constitutional requirement to rebalance the UK economy. Some of the more specific things that are being proposed in terms of devolution are really driving towards ensuring the right powers are in the right places. Devolution, clearly some will counter, has been taking place over a period of time in England, but it is still the case that the level of control over that from the centre is fairly extraordinary for a process that's supposed to be about dispersing power outside the centre. So we're saying there should be an economic growth and prosperity plan for every town and city, not for certain areas in a sort of bidding contest to central government. We're saying 50,000 civil service jobs should be transferred out of London, and more agency and public bodies headquarters moved out of London. One of the things, interestingly, we discovered when we did an economic analysis in Durham was actually, and this is as much about the private sector, just how few headquarters there were somewhere like County Durham. And the problem is that if you have a lot of employment, for example, but away from a headquarter, so effectively in a sort of remote office, it's very easy to downsize or close down those back offices when the sort of going gets tough. So I think the example of moving headquarters out of London is a very important one. Longer term financial certainty for councils to allow the stability I mentioned before, with at least 3-year financial settlements as a minimum. Local leaders to take new powers from the centre through a new process to initiate local legislation in Parliament. This is something that goes right back to the sort of Victorian period, I guess, the sort of golden age, some would say, of local government, when that time the local authorities were able to often have legislation which gave at that time control of utilities and so on, if you look right back to that period. Double devolution, very importantly as well, to push power closer to the people, to give more say to communities on issues that affect them. Certainly something, again, I had some experience of in Durham, where we had a number of participatory budgeting exercises involving thousands of people voting on how money should be spent, which I certainly believe very strongly is a way, again, of engaging people more and rebuilding trust in our political system.
Simon, I think you used the phrase double devolution a minute ago. Could you just explain what that is, as opposed to single devolution?
Well, I think it means, as I said, pushing power closer to the people, so not just to another sort of tier of government, if you like, whether that be local governments or whether it be devolved bodies. I think it means more say for communities on issues that affect them directly. Right. And as I said, I do think that's important in terms of rebuilding that trust. In terms of specific areas, there's more on this in the report. Areas that we've talked about include skills, further education, employment, transport, infrastructure, energy, environment, culture, and others. Really, there's no reason why a large number of areas should not be devolved to more local decision making. And as already mentioned, the report also highlights the need to develop and support clusters of excellence across the UK, growing a new, more broad-based and innovative economy, as well as a UK infrastructure bank, given an explicit mission to address regional economic inequality in the provision of infrastructure, which again is a big issue, coming from particularly from the northeast, where we've had an incredibly low proportion of the national spend on infrastructure, and a British business bank with a remit to promote regional economic inequality and access to investment capital. And if I can also just finish on, again, the issue of the sort of political reforms that are needed to tie this together. And we've heard obviously about the proposals in terms of the House of Lords, but it's also important to say that the recommendations are also underpinned by a series of what we call councils, a Council of the UK, a Council of England, to pull together some of the decision makers at different levels within the political system, something that just doesn't happen at the moment. This is not a distraction. This is the point I wanted to finish on. There was some sort of comments at the end. I think it partly came out of the Conservatives and right-wing press that somehow this was sort of irrelevant because we should be focusing on other issues. And of course, in a sense, they would say that, wouldn't they? But this is key in terms of the things we're talking about to address that economic underperformance, the inequality that we've talked about, which is at the root of so many of our issues right across the UK today. In fact, I think we can go as far as to say we will not solve those issues unless we deal with some of the issues that we talk about in this report. So it's not a distraction. It's absolutely crucial that we do address these issues. And I'm very confident as a member of the Commission and with the support, obviously, of the Labour front bench and Keir Starmer moving forward, that we will do that and that this can be delivered in the first term of a Labour government. Again, thank you very much for inviting me this evening, and I'll be very happy, of course, to expand more on some of those points later. Thank you.
Let me just take stock for 1 second. In a moment, by popular demand, a reappearance by the gentleman to my left, and then we'll be over to Thom Brooks for some sort of third-party comments. Then we will open this up to the audience. I know there are 1 or 2 people who want to make a contribution, and we can, I was going to say, we can take as long as we want on that part of the discussion, probably not quite as long as that, but certainly there is time for a good input from people both here and elsewhere. So start thinking of the points you want to make, and then something that you're probably already beginning to think about. We've got drinks and we've got canapes, and my understanding is but they are quite expensive, so they're probably quite good. Don't have to work before you've helped us to get our money's worth in a temple.
It's a minimum spend, we're not needing to spend.
Yeah.
Well, this wasn't an expensive report, but I feel it's not that bad. So I'm going to just act as sweeper. There are a few issues which haven't been touched on. One of them is about what this means for the UK as a whole, and in particular, I'm going to use Scotland as the example. I'll spare you the full detail of the death by PowerPoint. I think the interesting point is the one here that Simon made. The view of London is exactly the same from Dundee as it is from Durham. People are really cheesed off with London in Scotland, but they're really cheesed off with London in England as well. So that's the underlying argument here. We're not treating this as another Calman Commission or a Smith Commission, which is all about more powers for the Scottish Parliament and rebalancing the UK in that sense. There are some additional powers mentioned in that list, but it's really about relationships. It's really about making the intergovernmental system work and making the cooperative process work. So where we've got policy issues, folks say migration isn't working for Scotland, devolve it, including people who are not nationalists who say that because the migration system isn't working. The answer is no, let's make the cooperation system work. If that doesn't solve it, then maybe we can think about devolving it. So I mean, there are two key aspects to the relationship thing. One is yet another of these legal or constitutional obligations on governments to cooperate. It's extraordinary. We've got all these levels of government expectation from the public that they would work together, and no legal basis for that top, just an expectation. And then a set of structures, again based in statute, which Simon referred to, which include a Council of the Nations, a Council of the Nations and Regions, and the Council of England, with the Secretariat of their own that works. So that is, in a sense, the big offering to the Scots. This is about changing the UK. This isn't about the Scottish UK relationship view from Edinburgh. It's about the UK as a whole adjusting itself to a place in which the Scottish relationship will feel more comfortable. The single most important thing about that actually has nothing to do with Scotland at all. It's devolution in England. And because once England becomes a decentralised state, the UK becomes a decentralised state. It's incapable of dealing with devolved power well at the moment, because for 85% of the country it thinks it's a micromanager. It's a rotten micromanager as it happens, but it thinks it's doing that. When it's doing that, it's not doing its own job, and it's not dealing well with the centralised power elsewhere. The other thing, just to touch on, to complete the story, I'm not completely sorry, there's too many recommendations in this report, to finish off an issue, and that is, this is a bit I wish we didn't have to write. And this is the bit about standards in public life. Right? Things have been going to the dogs to an extent that is unacceptable. The good chap theory of government, sadly, is dead. Right? And I speak as somebody who spent most of his working life in the civil service and thought that the executive in general was a well-run institution with standards and behaviours and actions that I respected. And sadly, a lot of that has gone out the window. And I'm afraid therefore we've got a series of quite detailed recommendations and standards in public life. They begin with the complete ban on second jobs for MPs. Somebody, maybe they're a doctor or a dentist, keeping his or her teeth in place. We're certainly not what I'm talking about. And also an enforced ban on foreign money in British politics. It's not supposed to be there anyway in the system, but you don't have to look very far to find it, I'm afraid. And we've seen all sorts of stuff just in recent weeks, which wasn't discussed by us actually, on all parliamentary groups over the money for them is coming from. So something on foreign money, a complete and effective ban on it, and a particular chunk on the hapless person who is this week the Prime Minister's advisor on ethics. I don't know who it will be next week. And the job doesn't work. Time was it would have worked if we had a self-policing arrangement in government. We don't have that anymore. So we recommend merging that into an ethics advisor, independent of government, the ministerial code should not change when the Prime Minister changes. It doesn't in practice, but it doesn't exist until the Prime Minister makes it. And it should be approved by Parliament, and a particular role is for the second chamber. And then the fun bit, and that is, we thought quite seriously about whether breaches of the ministerial code and breaches of parliamentary standards should be judged by a jury of ordinary folk. Not quite seriously about that. We concluded that was just a bit much. But wait, you never know. But we did instead say that what we should have is a regularly convened citizens' jury, whose job is to review the operation of the system over the previous 12 months, including other cases, and come to a view as to whether or not that has sustained the trust of the public in the system of government. So that was just to fill in some of the gaps in our excellent presentation with my two colleagues in the building with me. What happens next, apart from conversation now? Keir Starmer was very positive about this report when he presented it, and he said he's putting it into consultation with a view to implementation. But he said, and I believe, one thing I know even better than he does, by God, it needs a bit of work. Right? There's an awful lot of work to be done on this if it's to be ready to become a piece of legislation early in the term of the Labour government. And that means a fuller consultation than we were able to do during our work, which was mostly COVID-ridden, and bringing to bear the expertise and knowledge of folks like yourselves on how we can make this actually work, how we can draft it, how it interacts with each other. There's lots of open questions. Some of them deliberately left, and some of them just incompetence, I'm afraid. But no doubt Tom is going to tell us which ones.
And some of them might emerge in the course of the next half hour.
Nice indeed.
Tom, over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm Thom Brooks, Professor of Law and Government at Durham, very happily not the Dean of the law school anymore. I'm an immigrant, very proud of that. From America, I'm going to be using some US examples in my comments, and I'm also an academic venture here. So good to see what the place looks like post everything, the new remodeling. Keir's leadership campaign talked about a lot of things. And one of the things that he talked about, and I was following him around as he was doing a lot of it, was the importance of empowering people and the importance of decentralizing. And this leadership campaign was particularly etched on me because I remember going to his headquarters to help with the leadership campaign, and had a beer, shook hands, said to him, Keir, I'm going to be back next week. And a few days later, the lockdown started. And so I was able to say during lockdown, the last person I had a beer with outside of my home in Sedgefield was Keir. But this theme of empowerment and decentralizing, about putting power closer to where it affects people, having people take more control of decisions, impacting them, was a kind of, I thought, a very powerful bit of his pitch. And it seemed to be something that he was particularly passionate about. And I was hugely excited to hear when this commission was being put together, hugely excited to see when the report was produced. I think it's one of the most incredible things I think I've seen as someone who's an academic, who likes treatises, Thomas Paine on common sense, all this kind of stuff. This has got, you're not spoiled for want of recommendations, in this at all, which is positive. And I think one thing that it surely gets right is it gets right a lot of the problems and things that need to be addressed. The tackling inequality, things have gotten much worse, the unlocking of potential and opportunities, and the rebuilding of trust. These are clearly things that we need to do. A transformational Labour government would surely be wanting to have a plan for doing something about this, and this commission report goes a very long way to helping spell out some various ways we might do so. One bit that it says and noted already is the need to consult more, and the idea of we have a starter for 10 here in this report, but then we need to go out and then see what how to flesh these things out, these different plans. What will this stuff look like in practice? How might it be implemented? And I think, with that in mind, I have some thoughts and reflections on that. And just on some, I can't talk about everything in the time because we do want to eventually get to that nice wine and canapes, etc. But some things that jumped out to me with my foreign eyes. One is to this idea of having more local power has importance, but I think that just kind of devolving power in itself won't guarantee that the problems will be fixed. We can change the law. There's also the changing behavior. There's also getting people on board. And one of the things I was thinking about with this is I come from a place that votes a lot. We vote a lot more than even some people might think we do. We vote in America for, well, dog catcher. We vote for president. We vote for I mean, I'm not suggesting that dog catcher is the bottom, but we vote for folks in between, above, beyond, depending on your point of view. We vote not just for the positions that people are in, and in some places, yes, and I don't like this, but we even vote in some areas for the judges who are going to be the judges. I'm from New Haven, Connecticut, just to kind of get that out there. I'm a British citizen. I'm allowed to be here. But I also lived for a couple of years in the great state of Arizona, which thankfully went the right way on a big vote, but not the right way if you are Donald Trump. And in Arizona, you do vote for the judges, you vote for the sheriff, Sheriff Joe, and other people in Maricopa County, I know it well, and so on and so forth. And so we have voting on that, but also we have voting on budgets. So in New Haven, Connecticut, where I'm from, you vote on school budgets. You take back control of your school budgets, as it were, and effectively what your tax is going to be in your local community. You also vote for your town budgets as well. Yes, they often lose. Don't have the statistical pie graph here. They often do lose the first vote, as people say, well, we'll have don't want to spend that much on various things. But this is given to the people, and it has problems, but it works. But even though Americans are voting regularly on what the schools will cost, who is going to be in charge of things, who will be on the school boards, and so we have this kind of very thoroughgoing devolution in that sense and local control. It doesn't mean that Americans are somehow less polarized or somehow more in love with or more satisfied with how this devolution has gone. So I think there's this importance of getting the structure right, and the commission report does that very well. But I think there's a lot of work to do around winning hearts and minds with this, and a kind of a very much bottom-up consultation of a meeting in the middle, of knowing what kinds of things need to be done and having a view about what those structures might look like, but also getting the people, the voters, ultimately, who will hope we will want to support the Labour government, seeing things from the other side. The other thing to say is in devolving power to local communities, one kind of aspect of that is in, say, the federal system we have. The report notes that federal system in the United States has got various problems. One of them is fostering gridlock. That's certainly true. But the other is it can also blur accountability. So when you have something very centralized, you can say, well, I know who's to blame for these decisions. It's the Secretary of State for this, the Secretary of State for that. But when you have various people who could be blamed for the schools or for delivery of various services, then there's an issue of being mindful, I think, of that as well. There's lots of things to praise. I wouldn't be here if I didn't like all this stuff. I think, pick out a couple of things, but I do want to be the critical friend rather than just throw praise at things. The constitutional protection of devolution arrangements is, I think, hugely important. Council of the Nations and Regions and of England, I think, is also a hugely important step as well. One thing I do find odd, or something maybe to reflect on a bit more, is I think the use of mayors, metro mayors, has been good. Has done a lot of good things. I think that the size and shape of some of the areas for metro mayors, it doesn't seem to fit the mayor name, especially if we want to do something different with the types of powers that these folks might have in the administrations they run. what's in a name? Well, I don't know, but it could give a bit of a stamp to it being something different. So, for example, the Northeast, and Simon will correct me on every fact I have to say about things there, but the idea of kind of having a body instead of someone like me in County Durham being run by Durham County Council, we have folks, bless you, in Newcastle being run by the Newcastle Council, having a metro mayor that will be all of Northumberland, County Durham. I mean, not even the police and crime commissioner of Northumbria extends into Durham. We got even two for that. And Vera Baird, an old friend, used to say, how huge her patch was in Northumbria, that it's going to be basically the size of two large geographical regions for PCCs to be run by women. It sounds governor to me, not just because of my place of birth. It sounds governor. Having that kind of name, I think, having a change of name, doesn't have to be governor, I think would be helpful to help symbolize and stamp. This is something Labour, and it's not just we want more of what the current government, as it were, has been doing, but then kind of helping to signal going in a different direction. You can see how friendly the criticism is. But I'm going to go to some other things as well. There's some tricky matters, I think, here. One is the legal requirement about having decisions taken as close and as meaningfully and practically possible by those affected by them. That principle I certainly agree with. And I note in the report they note various examples of how this is done, such as in Germany and successfully. So and so there is a model of thinking about how that will work. But one thing, I mean, one of the elements that got noticed, other than the House of Lords reform stuff, and I'll turn to that shortly because you'll be disappointed if I don't, is the power of tax and spend of local communities. And there's comments about having these kind of more robust, kind of longer term funding arrangements for local councils so they can plan better and having more control over how they spend tax revenue, as it were, as a kind of a first step in that direction. And I can see why kind of moving in this direction is kind of more incremental approach to being able to have tax raising powers themselves. But I do think that part of the importance of devolution, part of that unlocking potential and so on in the different regions will be delivered in part by areas being able to raise tax themselves and being able to come up with their own arrangements, place to place, how that works. I am, not into some of the competitive, proto-capitalist thinking about getting areas to fight each other in some kind of fight club, race to the bottom or other types of stuff, or people and other things. Nonetheless, I think it is something you see, for example, in places, whether it be Canada and its provinces, whether it be the United States and its states, and other places that have different systems where there are tax raising powers in more local areas, whether it be provinces, places, states run by governors, that you can have different areas decide, right, we're going to strategically go Golden Triangle, North Carolina. We're going to do something different to attract certain things here. We're going to go into that market. You have other areas that said we're going to go into automotive and go into manufacturing, and then arranging their tax system to some bit to play to these different types of things, and that's helped different areas grow and prosper. And I think that's something that I think is important. One, radical thought to add to a number of other radical thoughts. Some of the work that I've done in trying to help the front bench has been on home affairs policy, particularly around immigration issues. And one thing that I think would also be helpful in unlocking potential and so on that ought to be reflected on it's been hinted already by the panel, would be regional work visas. So one way of taking back control, as it were, you might say, is in having that control of local authorities run by governors in their areas to have some power to have visas there. At the moment, we have a kind of a one-size-fits-all thing that has a salary threshold, more easy to meet in some parts of the country than others. If you get a visa to come to work in the UK, unless it's a seasonal worker visa, then you can be anywhere you want in the UK. You can live in one nation of the UK. You can work in another, and move around as you like. And I think that's kind of moves talent away. Kind of centralizes, concentrates folks in one part of the country, one in the southeast, not so much other areas of the country that I think could possibly benefit by being able to have some regional work visas there. It's a system that has worked, I think, in Canada is one example that I would go on. And I could say more about that if people wanted to go there.
Tom, forgive me for interrupting you.
Not at all.
It's 7:15. We've been going for an hour.
As well as that.
I'm very keen to get the audience in. Can I bring you back in to deal with a question and move to the audience
Sure.
discussion now?
Okay.
Would you mind?
Sure.
Thank you
I'll
very much.
finish. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm keen to stimulate some discussion, both from people online who can put their comments into the chat, and Bren will monitor those, and from people in the room. As you've probably noticed, we're lucky enough to have Charlie Faulkner with us, Labour Lord Chancellor, formerly, I think, Minister for Constitutional Affairs.
Yes, that's right.
So his comments on the report would be very, very interesting. Charlie.
Thank you. First of all, can I say how impressive the report is? Genuinely impressive. It is a report of real vision, and it's a tribute to all the members of the Commission, to the vision and strategic strength of Gordon Brown, and to the authorship of Jim Gallagher. I really think it is impressive, and I agree completely with its two underlying principles, which are you've got to decentralize power in order to decentralize where wealth in this country is concentrated. And I also completely endorse the idea that you have to, in a way that is convincing, reform and clean up public life. And the changes that are made to the Constitution have got to be real in order for that to work. I also endorse completely the economic goals that such a constitution is there to deliver, which are defined as investment and revitalization of the public service, fighting regional inequality, and promoting high productivity and growth. And all of those I support, obviously. Change to the Constitution will not deliver any of those, but without the change to the Constitution, as Simon said, you won't get the changes. I read the report as providing a very broad framework. It's very important because Keir has endorsed it, the leadership of the Labour Party have endorsed it, but in the context that more work has to be done in it. Can I just identify a very few elements of the report which I'm interested in and think need further work? First, it is said the principles of our Constitution, the key principles of our Constitution, should be contained in a statute. And I think what you have in mind in relation to that is principles such as the rule of law, the integrity of our democratic situation. So you should not be able to undermine the electoral process in some way. Maybe you have in mind as well the integrity of the civil service. You cannot have ministers just sacking civil servants. And maybe you have in mind as well a process where the integrity of ministers has got to be upheld. Again, you're unclear, I'm not complaining about this, about how you enforce that, but are you thinking of having an EU type statute? I don't mean a European Union type statute, but a statute like the European Union Communities Bill, which if Parliament went beyond those principles, the courts would strike such a statute down. So if, for example, the government tried to produce a statute that fundamentally undermined the rule of law, is that something that the courts could strike down? I would recommend such an approach to you. If we had it in relation to our commitment to the European Union, surely we'd have it in what you've described as the fundamentals of our Constitution. The second area is devolution. Devolution not to England at this stage, but devolution to the kingdoms of the country. Are you disappointing in the way that the only protection you are giving to devolution is the second chamber being able to strike down something that is contrary to the Sewell Convention? Do you not need more? Do you not need to make the Sewell Convention part of our constitution? If the devolved assemblies cannot legislate in areas that are reserved, why should the reserved parliament not be equally prevented from doing so, save in specified circumstances? And do not rely on politics to enforce that, which is what you're saying, because as I understand the proposal, it is the Sewell Convention should be enforced by an elected second chamber. The third, so just quickly, the third one is the House of Lords. I completely agree with you that you have to go now big on the House of Lords. You have to change its composition. I am very dubious about the idea that your only protection in relation to pushing power down is a central government institution. It's failed in relation to the Commons to achieve that. Why is it going to be successful in relation to the House of Lords? Yes, of course, it will be a Assembly of the Nations and Regions, but so is the House of Commons, and it hasn't worked there. And then the fourth thing is, obviously, a lot more work is required on proper English devolution. Obviously, all of the powers that you refer to should be given to the various sorts of English institution, but how and when? And that's where we're. I end with one thought. This should have to be done in the first term of a Labour government, or we should fail if we haven't got enough of a majority to achieve it. If we don't do it in the first term, it'll never get done. That's the experience of the 1997 election, and it's not inconsistent with having a hard executive policy promoting all of these economic aims to also have a constitutional reform of this sort all happening together. So we really need to have got draft legislation ready before the election.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Charlie. We obviously can't ask all the panelists to deal with all the questions. I think I might ask Sarah just to comment, particularly on the sort of middle part of what Charlie was saying, the constitutional aspects, any aspect of that you particularly want to comment on, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, speaking for myself, those for the Commission, I absolutely share the ambition to do this within the first term, and absolutely share the fact that we need to be match ready. Alan 97, if you read all the work that was done on what became the Human Rights Act, for example, devolution, it was there, it was oven ready, to use someone else's phrase. I agree with you that there's no point in having a constitutional requirement that respects subsidiarity, respects local government as not just being a pure creature of state, but as being a standalone thing that respects devolution if it's not enforceable. And I, for one, would favour giving the Supreme Court the ultimate ability to strike down legislation or require that Parliament go back and achieve compliance with those constitutional requirements. I mean, that's what they're there for, putting them on that sort of statutory footing. The other thing, by the way, that I think we ought to give consideration to, and we allude to this, is around constitutional conventions. You know, somebody mentioned, I think it was you, Jim, you referred to the good chap theory of government. We've seen that come under threat, and it's been shown to be brittle. The prorogation of Parliament and what happened there being the perfect example, something that's a constitutional convention that if power gets into the wrong hands of whatever political persuasion, it can be ridden roughshod. And so I think we should be codifying that. But it's not enough simply to codify it. I'd agree with you. I think the courts need to understand that is part of their constitutional function. But that, as we know, is controversial, not least because of the games that politicians play in terms of undermining the reputation of our courts.
Well, you'll be playing those games soon.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Can I make one other final two sentences, which is that, you know, I think you say, well, is having a reformed second chamber, Assembly of Nations, enough of a bulwark? I think it is, if it understands that its purpose is that its primary purpose is that. And then, of course, it's not just the Reformed Second Chamber, it's the Supreme Court as well. So there's a double layer of safeguarding, the ability to make references to the Supreme Court to ultimately ensure that constitutional constraints and safeguards are upheld.
Thank you. Now, we've got lots of hands up, so I'm going to have to try and work out how we do this. I think you were first, so let's have a question from you. Say who you are.
Thanks very much. My name is Ewan McGaffey. I'm from King's College London Law School. I teach public law, labour law, and I've got a new book on economic and social rights and the economic constitution. I'm completely sold on devolution, devolving power. That's great. We need something like a Distribution of Industry Act in 1945. There's a question about how you get buy-in from local councillors, and so there's not some opposition. But my real question is about the social and economic rights list that is in the report, because I don't think the intention of the report is to go below the standards that we've got in international treaty obligations, like the International Bill of Rights of 1966, the great treaties that codified the Universal Declaration of the European Social Charter. But I'd just like to point out ways in which they diverge. So the report talks about the right to primary and secondary education, whereas the international covenants say that everyone has the right to higher education, to access it on the basis of merit, in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. The report talks about social assistance and nobody should be left destitute, whereas international law requires everyone has the right for an adequate standard of living for themselves and their family. There's nothing in the report about the right to just and favourable remuneration. And Jim, you started off with the inequality, the stagnation of wages, and there's not anything yet on a clean environment. So it's got a minimal set of economic and social rights. So I think that that's problematic, given that international law is of a higher standard than European law.
You've obviously got a lot to say during this consultation. Yes.
Yeah.
And the final thing is that there's a lot of literature on when the judiciary get hold of economic and social rights. They often interpret them in a way that's incredibly restricted to South Africa, Brazil. And so what would you do about that?
Okay, Tom, it might be interesting to have your comments on what Ewan has said from both an American and a British perspective. Do you want to comment on Ewan's points there?
Well,
even though you weren't on the commission.
no, I certainly wasn't. I mean, a few things I guess I'd say. I mean, I take the point about this. I mean, I think where the party wants to be in relation to a more expansive, different view of social rights, I think is still being somewhat worked out. I remember a year ago, Keir gave a speech at the annual conference of the Fabians last year about talking about capability and the importance of looking at a capability approach and wealth and quoting Sen and so on. And I do wonder. I mean, on the one hand, I think the things you say are pressing. I think it's an important area, but how far we need to go with some of these things in this particular constellation. I think you're going into some other areas that go a bit beyond maybe some of what this report might want to do. I think it's maybe a bit different.
Thank you. I'll take a question from the room from a lady, I think now, a female questioner, and then after that I'm going to ask Bren to identify the most interesting question online. This lady here to my left, yes. Yes.
Stand up, so I'm not very tall. Hi, Ellie Cumbo. I am the head of public law at the Law Society and also a Labour councillor in just over there, the London Borough of Southwark. I'm very sorry I'm going to fall into the trap of all the journalists, and I am going to ask about House of Lords reform. I really liked the recommendations around giving the House of Lords a specific responsibility around safeguarding the Constitution. I totally agree with the Sarah's itemisation of everything that's indefensible out the current House of Lords. What I can't quite get is why election is a necessary solution. I think all the things that were suggested could be done without election, and I'm not sure why it's considered a panacea, not least because we were shown a slide earlier that showed in terms of public trust, it's actually pretty a marginal gain, since both MPs and members of the House of Lords are right at the bottom. And I worry about the loss of expertise that could result. I'm sure most people in the room, like me, if they've watched a debate in the House of Lords, you find yourself almost invariably with a greater knowledge and understanding of the issue than before, which cannot always be said of the Commons. I worry that we would not replicate that under an elected system. And of course, what then is the justification for the primacy of the House of Commons?
Yeah.
So I'd be really interested to understand the
Interesting point.
thinking around that.
Jim, do you want to deal with that?
Yeah,
briefly?
sure. I
Briefly,
think
please?
that this is it's a fair and it's an important challenge. If we're going to give the second chamber, the new second chamber, the capacity to override the elected House on some matter or other, then it has to have a trump card of legitimacy of its own. And in the lawmaking system that we have, election brings legitimacy. There's a challenge here, of course, and Tom referred to it, is that you've got two competing legitimacies. And the way we sought to address that is first to say, well, you're legitimate for different things, so that the second chamber is able to be the boss, but only allowed to the limited range of matters, and after a certain kind of important social process, that goes to the solutions. And we also included a proposition that there could be a special arrangement under which the House of Commons can, in fact, override the second chamber 2000 majority or some other epicycle as an alternative. Now, I think the bottom line in all of this is that if you're going to get people to make the law, they have to be chosen by the people one way or another. And at the moment in the House of Lords, we've got folk who are appointed by birth, folk who are appointed by ordination, and folk who are appointed because they're pals of the Prime Minister. Doesn't work.
Thank you. Interestingly, the United Kingdom Constitutional Law Association, whose chair Sebastian Payne is here, they published a note by a lecturer at Bristol called Robert Greeley, which is all about the importance of political legitimacy in relation to the viability of the second chamber as you propose it. So there's clearly a big theme there. Now, let me see if Bren can identify a question from the online audience and read it out to us.
Well, it's an easy task because there's only been one.
Right.
But it's a good one. It's a good question. And essentially the question asks, are we concerned that when the report goes wider consultation, it will be watered down and pared back?
Simon, do you want to deal with that one?
Well, I think it's a good question. All the questions have been asking good questions. I think it is important. We all accept that it's important. There is this process of consultation at this time. Jim mentioned we didn't talk to as many people as I think we all would have liked to have done while we were sort of undertaking our deliberations. So it's very important we go through this period of consultation. Clearly, the other thing that's happening, and I think it's been alluded to also, ahead of the next election, which I assume will be about 18 months away, give or take, is that clearly the shadow front bench will be undertaking its own work and certainly looking at what we've come out with and how that will then be developed moving forward. I think it's been mentioned before, certainly there's been a very strong support given at the launch event and in all the messages that have come out from Keir and from colleagues. I should say that at the launch, it wasn't just Keir that attended, Rachel Reeves attended, Lisa Nandy attended, other front benchers attended as well. And I do think we've also seen that, for example, in some of the speeches that have been given subsequent to that by Lisa Nandy and others. And it's quite clear that they're taking forward from the ideas in the commission and moving forward in terms of their work within their own committee. So I mean their own draft shadow cabinet positions. So I'm optimistic, I have to say. Of course, there could be change in this period, but I'm certainly optimistic of where we are at the moment. And that the broad thrust of what we come out with will be there. as we obviously move into the manifesto process.
Yeah.
But of course, it's subject to all the the ways in which the Labour Party puts its manifesto together and the processes and procedures that I don't need to bore people with in terms of the National Executive Committee, the National Policy Forum, of which I'm a member, and all those other things. I'm optimistic. What I would say is the final point is I would encourage everybody though to get involved in that, to make sure that that the things that you feel are important are still there when we get through this. What is actually a very important period for and I strongly believe there will be an incoming Labour government. History tells us that the year to 18 months prior to that election are absolutely critical for the development of policy, because actually governments by and large don't have time to develop policy once they're in office. So it's a really critical period, and I would very much urge everybody to get involved in this.
I just want to follow this up with Jim. Is there a case for some form of process taking place alongside and contemporaneous with the consultation, which involves input from outsiders? But is there a case for the Commission or members of it, or some group of people relating to the Commission to work on implementation? I mean, I think one of the things that Charlie has been saying, certainly from my part, I feel very strongly, is that you've got to take many of your proposals and really dig deeper into them and work out exactly how they're going to work. Take, for example, the Nations and Regions Assembly, and how is that going to be composed? What is the representation of the regions going to be? What's the representation of Scotland, Ireland, and Northern Ireland and Wales going to be? That's just an example of where implementation is going to be key. There are other examples. So how do you see that process taking place? And ought it not to start pretty soon in some shape or form?
I see it through a glass dark clear at the moment, because the party hasn't quite come to a conclusion as to how it's going to do this. Speaking reasonably frankly, the party is making a transition at the moment from people in opposition to people who realise they're about to be in government. And that's a big shift of mindset. And I've never, of course, suggested that worthy bodies like the Society of Labour Lawyers should run with the ball. Somebody needs to run with it, right? There's a great deal that needs doing here. Go back to the question, will it be watered down? Charlie has his way to be beefed up, and maybe that would be a good thing. But we've got a lot of very important second order questions that we have. I fully acknowledge we have not answered. So we haven't really looked at the enforceability of social rights. I certainly would claim we've got the drafting of them absolutely correct. Though I would make a strong distinction between the ones we say which are going to be constitutionally guaranteed, which of course you have other rights than those subject to the same constitution.
Well, I don't think it's for the Society of Labour Lawyers to sort of pick the ball up and run with it. But as we've said in the past, the Society of Labour Lawyers could certainly help if there were a framework within which implementation was going to be discussed. Right, we'll try and get a couple more questions from the floor. And I think we'll go for another lady. Jill, would you like to ask your question? Concisely, please.
Yes, I'm an independent international lawyer and associated with Sixth Pump Court. So my eye fell on your recommendation number 17, treaty powers for Scotland. And I wondered if you could just explain how it would work, given that presumably the United Kingdom will be responsible internationally for any obligations that Scotland enters into. And why is it there? I mean, is the Scottish government asking for these powers, or is this an idea, Jim, perhaps that came from within the Commission itself? Be very interested to know.
The idea's been in circulation for a bit. The Scottish government does have an international presence. The legal basis for it is a little shaky. They've got about 9 international representations, which they had, of course, before devolution, in fact, but you will remember that. But it's partly symbolic. What we're talking about is one nation within a larger state, and partly real, because there are things you can do. And there's a wee bit of Belgian experience, and no one's ever taken an example of Belgium. We did manage to do that on this occasion. The aim was to say to people in Scotland, well, actually, we can have a space on the international stage without the inconvenience of becoming independent. It's a straightforward.
I think you're going to need to have a conversation with Jim about this.
Yeah.
Right, now the next question, we've got an all-male shortlist, so women need not apply. George, I'll come to you, but can you make it very concise, and then I might get the guy at the back of the room as well.
I will indeed make it very concise. Going back to composition of the upper house, did you consider, and if you did, why did you reject the idea of copying in slightly different examples, but of both our nearest large neighbours, Germany and France, and having an upper house that is indirectly elected in different ways by local government as a way of having some electoral legitimacy, but not so much electoral legitimacy as a challenge that comes, and also by its very nature inclined to protect devolution and local government. And if I just one very short point as well about local government finance is absolutely critical. And the paragraph in the report that deals with it is slightly disappointing because it sort of says the Shadow Chancellor will decide this. But if devolution is to be work and to be robust, local government has got to have an independent finance base that can't be attacked by the Treasury, which is the real enemy of devolution in Whitehall and therefore in Westminster. And one that just can't be fiddled around with by local government, by central government to win.
The gentleman at the back, if he still wants to ask
Thank
a
you,
question.
Steve. Gentleman at the back, Stuart Brady, barrister, also aspiring MP and former candidate. Yeah, my question relates to the political economy of our public services has changed quite a lot in recent times. You think about multi-academy trusts, housing associations, CCGs. A lot of that has escaped democratic control. So if we're taking back control, it would be interesting to see any insights at the local government level as to how that could be done through a process such as this. And local government seems another area that's ripe for reform. I don't think the last reform was 1970s, the local government, and having lived around the country. For example, in London, there's no community level governance, there's nothing like parish councils, which is a good volunteer level where people do feel they're in control, they do feel connected, and it's cheap. And also we've got lots of councillors that are paid next to nothing, and the accessibility of the councillor role, somebody who has to actually keep a day job, is actually minimal. So I think those areas are ripe for looking at. Now, with my politicians hat, I do wonder how a lot of this is solved, because obviously it's quite dry. A lot of the beard stroking that's gone on in this room relates to House of Lords reform, etc., etc. But I think the clue lays in the North East referendum, which is Dominic Cummings' first outing, when he just majored on getting rid of politicians. And I think there's a lot in that, because if you go for a parish layer which is largely voluntary, if you halve the number of local politicians and pay them more, making it more accessible, get rid of an unnecessary layer of government in many instances, I think you've got a good selling point there. But we've got to roll the pitch politically if we're going to get this stuff done. And there's some thoughts.
Thank you very much. Now, what I'm going to try and do, because I know there are probably 4 or 5 people who still want to ask questions, if you can promise me to do it in 3 sentences each, we'll have everybody who had their hand up have a go. But I'll stop you after the 3rd sentence, and that does not mean a sentence that lasts for a page and a half. So who wants to go next? Yes, this lady here.
Hi, Carolina. I work as a comms professional at Global Council. I'm just a humble comms person, not a lawyer. Therefore, I can already see in my mind the relentless campaign of the Daily Mail over 4 years to make this die and just shrink in size to the point of self-destruction. So what is the comms campaign strategy?
Very good question. Yes, this gentleman here.
So I'm wondering if the Commission looked at how to tackle issues like extreme poverty or homelessness. I attended a talk by Stephen Dorking, I think his name is, or David Dorking, Professor of Geography at Oxford, Fentopia, what you can learn from the world's happiest state. And he said he just couldn't find, homeless people found on one hand in the entire country. And one of the things they do, the first thing they do is put the person in with a roof over their head and then link them up with all the services. Yeah. So it's also about an approach. Have we thought outside the box?
Thank you. Anyone else? No, okay, the notion of a drink is becoming more and more pressing. So what I'm going to do now is this, on your behalf, I'm going to ask Bren to text the organizer of this meeting at Inner Temple and to tell him that in 5 minutes' time, we will want our drinks, okay?
They're already out.
Oh, good, right, fine. Thank you for that. Oh, right, or you mean remotely?
Yes.
She wants to actually do it vocally, does she?
Yes.
Right.
I think Rachel can sort that.
Well, if we can hear Catherine Atkinson, our chair,
yes.
then let's hear from her now. Yeah,
Well,
there you
we'll
are.
see if the technology works.
Go ahead.
Which I can't. I really, all I wanted to say is to thank the commissioners for all of their work and for involving SLL in this piece of work, and to particularly make sure that Stephen and Bren are thanked for their considerable work from the society, and to encourage what has already been set out, all of our members to make sure that we are enabling this to be the incredibly dynamic and the opportunity that this can give for real change. So it's just a thanks. I'm very sad that I'm not going to be able to participate in the very expensive canapes, but it has been a fantastic event, and really well done to Stephen and for Bren for pulling it all together.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I was going to go around the table again, but I think we probably all agree that now is a good moment to stop. Thank you again to our panelists and to Tom, and we look forward to seeing you over a drink outside. Thank you very much.